If, like me, you grew up in the 1980s, you might remember games like Astro Wars, Galaxy Invader, or Munchman. But did you ever know anybody who had a Super Kong? Growing up, I wasn't lucky enough to have any of these games, but now as an adult, I have a pair of Kongs of my own. So on today's Retro Tech Repair, we're going to be trying to fix my CGL Super Kongs that I bought spares or repair on eBay. Okay, so I don't have the eBay listings for these. I think one of them came as a job lot, the other I bought, and I've lost track of how much I paid. So we'll just have a quick look at them. They look superficially more or less identical, a little bit more wear in some areas than in others, but basically pretty much the same. So we'll put one aside and we'll look at this Kong to start. So open it up. Battery compartment looks clean, so maybe we'll just slip some batteries in it straight away and see what it does. Looks like these are in the incorrect orientation, but I don't think that's the case. I think they're supposed to be that way around. A little bit tight. Nothing from Kong 1. Nope. Completely dead. Alright, well, we'll take a look at that in a moment. In the meantime, let's take a look at Kong 2. So here's Kong 2. Again, not in bad condition cosmetically. But when we open it up, it has a kind of whiff of old battery about it, and there's obviously some fairly obvious corrosion on the battery terminals. Don't know if that's enough to stop it working or not. We'll slide the batteries in and we'll take a look. And again, completely dead. I'm pretty sure the batteries are good. So we're going to start looking at this Kong 1. All right, let's pop our Kong away. So let's open this up and see what's going on. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 screws on the bottom. We'll see if they make a kind of clicky sound when we undo them. No, that's got the distinct kind of sound of one that's been opened before. I think somebody's been in my Kong. Looks like all of our electronics are in the back side of our Kong. Pretty dirty in here. Don't see anything obviously burnt. Naturally, I'm suspicious of these transistors. I don't know if you've seen any of my other videos, but I do tend to find these power transistors in these VFD games are quite susceptible to failure. Also, we have a power connector here, which sometimes kind of gum up if it's been used with only batteries or perhaps only with a power supply. Then we get kind of oxidization on these contacts and it cooks off power to the rest of the board. So there's a couple of things that we can try there. Otherwise, it looks pretty straightforward. Keep that spring out of the way. Get those screws safe too. I'd say a bit dirty. VFD display still has some Getter compound on it. Vacuum is still intact. There isn't a lot of Getter on that display. This is a kind of black stuff that's flashed onto the display when it's manufactured. So when the display off gases, it kind of absorbs those things. Yeah, I don't see a lot of it in there. Normally I would see more than that, but if it had gone to air, then we'd expect that to be white, because this is a vacuum. If air gets in, then the display stops working, but you have this little black spot that normally will turn white or grey if the display is defective. And of course, we would have probably heard the sound of the game if the game was working at all. Okay, so maybe we'll carry on now and just see what's on the back of this printed circuit assembly. It looks like these screws are slightly shorter that are holding in the printed circuit assembly, and that's something to be aware of so that we don't end up accidentally putting a screw in that's too long and coming through the exterior of the case, which unfortunately I have done before on different games or computers. Just 2 screws holding the printed circuit assembly. We have a piezo electric sounder on the back and fairly simple printed circuit assembly labelled with Zeny, Z-E-N-Y, and then a number. Doesn't, on first impression, seems to be anything particularly unpleasant going on there. If that piezo sounder is glued in, we can get that out. I do like to separate the electronics from the plastics most of the time when I'm doing these games. I just find it so much easier to work on them, and usually worth the time just to do that. Even takes a couple of seconds just to solder it back up. So I'm just going to unsolder this directly from the printed circuit assembly here. I find that much easier than trying to solder onto these piezo sounders. So maybe that is crimped on as well as soldered. Yeah, maybe it is. Interesting. Well, for now, I think I'm going to have enough wire in there. I'm just going to snip that off. I think that's the first time that I've seen that, where these have been both crimped and soldered into position. Quite interesting. All right. So we're out of the plastics. We just have our VFD display on our printed circuit assembly. Not much on here. As I say, the transistor, some resistors, some diodes, power switch, and then presumably the microprocessor or microcontroller is mounted underneath that VFD display. And in fact, it looks to be that way. There's evidence of a dual inline package there with the solder pins. So yeah, first thing to do is see if we're getting power into the board through these connectors. So I'll just strip these wires back a little bit so we can get some power to them. Now I know I could have just connected power up to the board, but I've melted too many enclosures with clumsy soldering iron work before now that I'm keen not to do that again. Off camera, I have my bench power supply. I'm going to set that to just around 6 volts, and we'll limit the current to something fairly modest, and we'll look nothing from the switch still. Okay, so the next thing then is we'll see if we're getting continuity through this power connector here. Just a little bit off camera. There we go. See if we've got continuity from this power connector here to the board. So with my multimeter, I'm just going to set that to volts, DC. See that on the camera? Great. And we'll measure the voltage at the power supply input. 5.96 should be good enough. And then we'll measure it at this connector coming out. Bit fiddly. Let's try a different way. And what do I have there? Nothing. Really? Could it be that simple? There's again here. Nothing. So it looks like it is actually, this connector's kind of gummed up or faulty. It's a weird kind of connector. Let me see if I bypass that, if the game will come straight up. So I'll switch off the power supply, we'll bypass the connector and put the positive on the other side of it, just here. Careful not to short anything out. That's going to be okay, and we'll try again. Aha! Ah, you can see that. Just dim the lights. There we go. It's as easy as that. This connector's faulty. Apart from that, this thing's working great. Fantastic. Well, I say it's working great. Yeah, seems to be. Brilliant. Excellent. Okay, well, I suppose a little bit of a waste of time taking it out of the plastics. Never mind, we'll get this connector cleaned up with some IPA. So I have here some isopropanol 99.9%, and I'm just going to pop a little bit of that in the cap, which I will almost inevitably spill everywhere because I always do. And then I have these things, which are kind of various power adapters that I have. So I'm just going to take the one that fits, which I think is going to be this one, dip it in the IPA and work the connector a bit. It's a bit loose. Dip the connector in it too. Give it a chance to work its way in. Now, of course, you would be able to use this with a power supply once it's working. Right, let's see if that's enough. So we're hooked back up to the power supply now, and yeah, no, it looks like it wasn't enough. So I'm going to have to kind of do something more mechanical with this, I think. Maybe scrape some of the oxidization that's in there away. This is quite hard to capture on the camera here, but inside of this switch is a little metal contact, and when you insert the kind of power adapter, sorry for this really bad camera work here, zoom out, it'll focus a bit better. You insert the adapter, it kind of pushes that metal pin inside out of the way, but when you remove it, it's not going back. So I'm just going to try and force it back into place with a screwdriver here, and we'll see if that fixes the problem. And we have this connected to the bench power supply now, and we'll switch on the power supply over here and switch on the game. Fantastic. There it is. Seems to be working fine. Let's just try plugging this in. This is where the power would usually go in. That shuts off the power to the game from the batteries, and removing it restores the power to the game, so that's perfect. Sorry about the blurry video in the last segment there. I'm not much of a cinematographer. So I'm just going to talk through the next bit. Essentially, I just disassembled everything to cleaned it, and then reassembled it, soldering the battery connections and the piezo sounder connections back onto the printed circuit assembly and the battery terminal before reassembling everything and giving it one last test. Excellent. Okay, well, that's Kong 1. We'll not get too excited. We'll take a more detailed look at that when we've done Kong 2. So here we have our second Kong, and it's rattling. Let's take a look. Yeah, quite badly corroded, and in fact I can see there we have still some kind of liquid, probably stuff that's leaked from batteries in the past, so not a great start. Putting that off. It does have a smell about it, not very pleasant too, and the screws are quite corroded and have definitely been opened before, so yeah, we'll see. Hopefully we can do something with this. And let's see how bad things are underneath. Yeah, that is interesting. Not quite sure that that is. It's like maybe some plastic thread, that's come from here. Who knows? It does have a very kind of acrid smell. Switch looks like it's seen quite a lot of kind of action. I don't know whether that's corrosion or rework. Really not sure. Let's get the plastics away from this, unsolder these. I'm going to have to clean these battery terminals up anyway. Get some power switch from the bench power supply, and we'll take it from there. Again, I did check this, and the blue is negative and the red positive. Let's move the plastics completely out of the way, then I don't get a hot soldering iron on them by mistake. And we'll hook this up to our power supply. This power supply is set to 6 volts, and so far nothing. Try the switch. Oh, well, it will be nothing because it's come off. Oh, and it works. Look at that. Oh, wow. So what an easy repair. This is going to be Looks like I've just got dirty battery contacts over there. Well, how about that? So as I clean up the board with some IPA, you might be thinking that perhaps this isn't going to be the most exciting repair video that you've ever seen, and you're probably right. But stick around, because actually I do make a mistake or two, and there might be some lessons learned towards the end. Guess I should make sure the jump button still works. Connect the power up one more time. Hello? It used to work. Oh, hang on. It turns out we have an intermittent switch on our hands, but I think it's probably just corrosion, and we'll clean up okay with some IPA. Using IPA on this can leave the switch a little stiff because there's no lubricant in there. That probably accelerates wear. So I do sometimes use a kind of lubricated switch cleaner on this, but I've lost a little straw that goes with it, which means I can't apply it precisely, so it goes everywhere. So I probably should buy myself another one, or a pack of those straws, so I can redirect it to where it's supposed to be. Okay, well, we're going to pop that aside a second and just turn our attention briefly to these rusty battery contacts. Now, the rusty battery contacts were a bit of a nightmare to remove. I tried initially prizing them out with the screwdriver, but they were well and truly stuck in place. And I tried also kind of pulling them out with pliers, and in the end I just had to kind of hit them with the back of the plier until they came free. Okay, something came loose. There it is. All right, slightly better condition than the other, but really not in great shape at all. Okay, well, let's see what we can do with these. May as well take the other ones out. Do we need to? Probably not. I'm probably going to try and clean these up in situ. And these, well, I'm not sure what to do with these. So the positive battery terminals cleaned up quite nicely when rubbed with a fiberglass pencil in situ, but the negative battery terminals were very heavily corroded. These are in pretty bad way. I'm just going to try and remove the very thick rust, perhaps. I don't think there's much chance of us preserving these in the original shape. What I'd really like to know is if the electrical connection between here and here is preserved. So let's take a quick look at that. So we'll put our meter on continuity. There we go. We'll go on the spring and the contacts. No. So it's there on the spring. Oh yeah, it is. Good. They're kind of crimped on here. So if we've got that, that's good. The rest of it's unpleasantly cosmetic, but if we can get it to go back in the plastics, it should be fine. So we'll go ahead and do something with this. I'm trying to work out what to do, really. Let me have a think about it. So I have a little bit of a science experiment here. I have a jam jar, or strictly speaking a peanut butter jar, with just a little bit of water in the bottom of it. And I also have some citric acid. This happens to be one brand, but many brands are available. I'm just going to add a little bit of that to the water. And give that a swirl around. Yeah, it's largely dissolved the citric acid. And then I'm going to pop these in. They don't seem to be bubbling much. That's my multimeter turning off. Maybe I need a bit more citric acid. That's all dissolved, so we'll make a stronger solution. Oh, yes. I'm sure that's plenty. I'm not even sure this is going to work anyway, so I'll give it another swirl around. Yeah, I'm not going to get any more than that of it to dissolve, I don't think, so we'll pop this in now. And we'll see if it has a reaction. I'm going to do the same with this one. So it's actually been a couple of days and it's finally time to take this out of the citric acid. We'll get it cleaned up with a little bit of IPA and we'll see what it looks like. And my worry is, and I think it's confirmed, that there isn't actually that much of these left. But as you can see, hopefully you can see, let's take a look at that. What is left has cleaned up remarkably well, considering how rusty it was. Very obviously frail at the edges, but considering how rusty this was to start, I am very pleased with the results from that. So we'll take one and then the other, and we'll get them cleaned up in a little IPA and soldered back in to our Super Kong. Sorry for my shaky camera work here, but here's a quick close-up of the battery terminals ready to go back into our Kong. Right, so the little solder tab survived okay on one of these battery terminals, but not on the other. It kind of broke off as I was interacting with it. So I'm going to try and solder something onto here so that then I can solder the wire onto it when it's back in the game. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and use a little bit of copper wire from this mains cable. I've got some kind of twin and earth mains electrical cable here. I'm going to use some of that solid core just to solder onto here, and hopefully then I'll be able to solder the wire onto it when it goes back in the board. That does not want to stick. Ah, it seems we have a problem, and in fact, a much bigger problem than it might first appear. I actually spent much longer trying to heat up this solder joint than I showed in the clip, but we have to move on. My theory is that whatever happened to the metal when it was in the citric acid resulted in it being kind of coated in a non-solderable sort of substance, so I needed to clean that away with a file before I was able to get any kind of solder to stick to it. But eventually I did get it to stick, cleaned it off with some IPA, and installed it and the other battery contact back in the game before soldering all the wires back in place. I've had a bit of a tidy up, so let's get everything cleaned up and put back together. So even the original Donkey Kong was never really my game, and I found this particular implementation of it quite hard. I did eventually manage to get to the second level, but if you want to know what the subsequent levels look like, you might just have to go and buy one for yourself. Oh, I see. Well, on this one we seem to have a lift. So yeah, perhaps not the most taxing of repairs today, but I did learn something. The citric acid trick worked reasonably well, I suppose, but you really have to be prepared to work quite hard to remove the residue from that citric acid treatment before you can get any solder to stick to the battery tabs, and I probably wouldn't use that approach in future. Maybe use vinegar or something else instead. As for the game itself, I found it quite enjoyable to play. It's a little bit hard, but it does a reasonable job of a kind of Donkey Kong style game, given the limitations of a fixed VFD display. And of course, it being a VFD display, the graphics are nice and bright and colourful. I did spot that there is a slight difference between the games, and I was curious to know if you spotted it too. So let's take a quick look at the other game. I noticed this one has a number of remaining heroes. And back to the first game. Well, I've just noticed from the graphics on the front here that it does have an indication of the number of remaining boys. That's handy. So whether it's heroes or boys, that just about wraps it up for our CGL Super Kongs for today. I'm sorry that it wasn't a more intriguing repair today, but I do get plenty of questions from people who have games not dissimilar to this, with faulty switches or corroded battery terminals, and I thought it was worth putting the video out. And of course, when you buy game spares or repair on eBay, you don't always get to choose what's wrong with them, so this might be reflective of the sort of thing that you might encounter if you try to do something like this for yourself. But I do hope you've enjoyed looking at my Kongs today, and that if you have, you'll consider hitting subscribe. So until next time, I'd just like to thank you so much for watching Retro Tech Repair. Oops. and off we come with the lid.